The thermometer outside the Harlan County Courthouse nailed itself to minus 31 degrees Fahrenheit on the morning of January 12, 1888, and it didn't move for 3 days. The wind came in from the northwest with a sound that old-timers said was unlike anything a living person should ever have to hear. A high, constant scream that didn't gust, didn't pause, didn't breathe. It just was. Continuous. Total. The kind of cold that turned exhaled breath into ice crystals before it had traveled 6 inches from a man's lips. 17 people in Furnace County, Nebraska, would be dead before the storm broke. 41 more across the southern Dakota Territory. Livestock froze standing up in barns that men had considered perfectly adequate the morning before. The Oleander family, mother, father, and 3 children under the age of 8, were found huddled against their own hearth, the fire long dead, the parents positioned over the children in one final protective instinct that hadn't been enough. Their house was a standard timber frame homestead, well built by any measure of the era, with a real shingle roof and newspaper-stuffed walls. It wasn't enough. Nothing, it seemed, was enough that January, except for one structure. A peculiar, low-slung, half-buried combination of barn and living quarters that sat on the south-facing slope of a creek draw about 7 miles southwest of the town of Arapahoe, Nebraska. A building that the county's most experienced settlers had spent the better part of 2 years calling a waste of a man's labor, a hazard to his cattle, and the clearest possible evidence that a Norwegian who'd spent his first 38 years near the Arctic Circle still didn't understand the American frontier. Inside that building, on the worst morning of the worst blizzard in recorded Nebraska history, a man named Eric Solberg was sitting at a rough-hewn table eating corn porridge, his coat hanging on a peg near the door, his shirt untucked, his 2 daughters playing on the earthen floor nearby, while 3 cows and a team of draft horses breathed slow, warm clouds of contentment behind a partition wall 12 feet away. The temperature inside the building, measured with a spirit thermometer that Eric had owned since his years in Tromsø, was 65 degrees Fahrenheit. It had not dropped below 61 at any point during the storm. That building, and the man who designed it, and the 2 years of ridicule that preceded that January morning. That's the story we're going to tell today. If you've ever looked at how our ancestors solved problems that modern engineers still struggle with, you understand why this channel exists. Stick with this one all the way to the end, because the technical details of what Eric built are genuinely remarkable and the final numbers are almost unbelievable. Let's go back to the beginning. Eric Halvard Solberg was not the kind of man who explained himself. He was 40 years old when he filed his homestead claim on 160 acres in Furnace County in the spring of 1884, traveling alone and arriving by wagon from the railhead at McCook with a modest collection of hand tools, 2 draft horses of Norwegian fjord stock, heavy, compact, cold-weather animals that the locals immediately questioned, a milk cow, and a trunk of personal belongings that included, somewhat mysteriously to anyone who glanced at it, a collection of surveying and measuring instruments that seemed excessive for a man of obvious modest means. His English was accented but competent. He'd spent 4 years working as a carpenter and construction hand in Chicago before deciding that city wages and city life were not what he'd crossed the Atlantic for. He was wide across the shoulders, quiet in conversation, and had the particular economy of motion common to men who'd spent their lives doing hard physical work in cold weather. Every movement purposeful, nothing wasted. He had no wife when he arrived, which the settlement women at the nearby cluster of farms known locally as Cottonwood Creek noticed and discussed with considerable interest. He had no children, which the settlement men noted and dismissed as a temporary condition of little concern. What both groups noticed more than anything else was where he chose to build and how he chose to do it. Every other homesteader in the area had staked their claim on high, flat ground, prairie that let you see for miles in every direction, that gave the wind nowhere to hide, that felt like the vast open American promise of the advertisements back east. Eric Solberg walked his 160 acres for 4 days before putting a single stake in the ground, and when he finally chose his building site, it was a shallow north-facing draw, almost invisible from the road, set back 200 feet from the creek and tucked into the slope at an angle that made no immediate sense to anyone who saw it. Clarence Pell was the first to say something about it. Pell was 47 at the time, a former Ohio farmhand who'd been homesteading in Nebraska since 1871 and had survived 2 of the previous decade's brutal winters, including the blizzard of 1873 that had killed his first milk cow and two of his pigs. He rode out to Eric's claim on a June afternoon, ostensibly to introduce himself and offer the kind of neighborly assistance that was both genuinely kind and functionally necessary in a community where everyone's survival depended to some extent on everyone else's cooperation. He looked at the stakes Eric had driven, looked at the lay of the land, and then looked at Eric with the particular expression of a man who is trying to be polite about something he considers a serious error. "You know that slope faces north," Pell said. Eric looked at him. "I know. Sun doesn't hit it much. You'll be cold in winter and your garden won't grow. The garden will be there." Eric pointed to a flat bench 40 yards to the east, where the morning sun would fall unobstructed. "This is for the building." Pell studied the site again. "You're going to need a deeper foundation if you're building into that hillside. And hauling stone up that slope is going to be—" "I have time," Eric said. That was essentially the end of the conversation, though not the end of Pell's opinions, which he shared freely at the general store in Arapahoe over the following weeks. He'd met this Solberg fellow, he reported. Seemed capable enough, wasn't unfriendly, but had picked a building site that made no practical sense. North-facing slope, buried in a draw, hidden from his own access road. You'd spend all winter carrying firewood downhill through snow, and your nearest neighbor couldn't see your smoke to know you were in trouble. Pell was not wrong about any of these concerns. What he was missing was the part of Eric's reasoning that he hadn't asked about. There's something worth pausing on here, something that makes this story more than just a tale about one clever immigrant. In Norway, in Scandinavia generally, and in large stretches of northern and eastern Europe, the practice of building structures that sheltered animals and humans in adjacent or connected spaces was not considered eccentric or primitive. It was the accumulated result of roughly 1,000 years of people dying when they didn't do it, and surviving when they did. The Norse word for it was eldhus in some regions, though the combined barn dwelling took many names across different communities. In Iceland and the Faroe Islands, structures called skalli had housed both families and livestock under a single roof since the settlement period. Scandinavian farmers building in Minnesota and Wisconsin had been quietly recreating versions of this arrangement since the 1850s, often to the bafflement of their Yankee neighbors. A Ukrainian immigrant in central Kansas named Dmytro Havrilyuk had built something similar in 1879, combining his sod house and animal shelter into a single south-facing earthen structure that his American neighbors called ungodly, but that kept his family alive through the winter of 1880, while two neighboring families lost children to exposure in their otherwise adequate frame houses. The Irish had their own version, the longhouse, where the family occupied one end and the cattle the other, a practice that English landlords had spent 2 centuries trying to eliminate as uncivilized and that Irish tenants had continued because it worked. This knowledge wasn't exotic, it was just old. Eirik Solberg had grown up in it. If you find yourself fascinated by the kind of practical wisdom that kept ordinary people alive in extraordinary circumstances, the kind of knowledge that didn't make it into textbooks, but absolutely made it onto headstones when it was ignored, this channel is where we dig that up. Consider subscribing and joining the tens of thousands of others who believe that keeping this kind of history documented and alive is worth doing. We'll be here every week. Construction began in late June of 1884 and continued through the summer and into October with a methodical intensity that Eric's neighbors found simultaneously impressive and puzzling. He started, to everyone's surprise, not with walls, but with excavation. He dug into the hillside with a mattock and a long-handled shovel for 3 solid weeks, creating a roughly rectangular cavity in the slope that was 62 feet long, 28 feet wide, and 7 feet deep at the rear wall. The dirt he removed, he didn't haul away. He piled it carefully in 2 long ridges flanking the planned building site, 18 inches high on each side, which Clarence Pell rode past one morning and correctly identified as absolutely pointless. "He's making more work for himself," Pell told his wife Nora that evening. "All that dirt's just going to wash in the first hard rain." It didn't wash. Eric had shaped the ridges with a slight outward pitch that directed runoff away from the excavation, and he'd cut a shallow drainage channel at the back of the dig that redirected groundwater around the structure's footprint. This was detail work, the kind of thing you only think to do if you've watched what happens when you don't. He was also, at this stage, doing something that Pell couldn't see from the road, testing the soil layers in his excavation with the methodical attention of a man who understood that what was under his building mattered as much as what was in it. At a depth of 4 feet below the original grade, the soil temperature in the hillside held steady at 52 degrees Fahrenheit throughout July and August. Eirik measured it every 3 days for 6 weeks, pushing a thin iron rod into the exposed earth and holding his thermometer against it. 52 in July, 52 in August, 51 in September, dropping perhaps half a degree. He wrote these numbers in a small, leather-bound notebook he kept in his shirt pocket. The earth below the frost line was not warm exactly, but it was consistent. And on the Great Plains, consistent was a kind of wealth. The foundation walls went up in August. Not timber, which was what everyone expected and what required hauling lumber 50 miles from McCook at considerable expense, but stone. Limestone outcropped along the creek draw in slabs that Eirik quarried with a hand drill and steel wedges, shaping each piece with a mason's hammer into rough-fit blocks that he laid without mortar in a dry stack technique that looked careless until you noticed how precisely each course was leveled and how tightly the courses interlocked. The walls were 2 feet thick at the base, tapering to 18 inches at the top of the foundation course, dimensions that made his neighbors raise eyebrows at the sheer labor involved and shake their heads at the apparent excess. A 12-inch stone wall was more than adequate. What was the man building? A fort. He was building a battery. Not in the electrical sense, of course. That technology was still confined to telegraph wires and city novelties in 1884. But in the original sense of the word, which meant a collection of things arranged to act together. Eirik was building a thermal battery. 2 feet of limestone at the base of his walls held roughly 14 times the heat storage capacity of the same volume of timber framing. The stone would absorb heat during the warmer months, releasing it slowly as temperatures dropped. It would also, critically, block the infiltration of cold air at the ground level, where most of the energy loss in a standard frame structure occurred. He'd watched this dynamic his entire life in Norway, where stone foundations on old farmhouses had kept root vegetables and dairy products at remarkably stable temperatures year-round without any artificial intervention. It wasn't magic, it was mass. By the 1st of September, the foundation was complete, and Eirik turned to the walls. Here, too, he departed from what anyone expected. The standard homestead construction of the era was single-wall timber framing, vertical or horizontal logs, or increasingly balloon frame construction with dimensional lumber, which was fast, cheap, and reasonably sturdy, and which bled heat to the outdoors at a rate that required near constant fire management through the winter months. Eirik built double walls. The inner wall was horizontal log construction, 8 inches of cottonwood in the lower courses and pine in the upper ones, notched and fitted tightly at the corners. The outer wall, set 8 inches away from the inner one, was a second frame of lighter timber and filled with the cut limestone he'd been stockpiling. The 8-inch cavity between them he packed with a material that earned him more ridicule than anything else he did. Dried cattail fluff, harvested in enormous quantities from the creek margins, mixed with a layer of dried grass and tamped into place with a wooden paddle. "Cattail packing," Clarence Pell announced at the general store in October, with the tone of a man delivering a punchline. "The Norwegian has packed his walls with cattail fluff, like a bird's nest." The laughter was general and not unkind. Pell wasn't being cruel. He genuinely thought Eirik was wasting his time. Every old-timer in Furnace County knew that cattails were no use for anything serious. Tule grass maybe for rough thatching, but as insulation in a wall cavity, you might as well stuff the walls with your mistakes. What Pell and the others didn't know, and what modern building science would eventually quantify and confirm, was that dried cattail fluff has an insulation value roughly equivalent to modern fiberglass batting when packed at moderate density. The air trapped between the fibers is the mechanism, the same principle that makes a fur coat warm, or that drives the design of every insulated material developed in the subsequent 140 years. Eirik couldn't have written you an equation for thermal resistance, but he could have told you exactly what the walls of the old farmhouses near Tromsø were packed with, and why those buildings stayed warm while the newer, fancier Norwegian houses modeled on continental European fashion got cold and stayed cold. There was also this: the outer stone wall created a thermal buffer. Cold air hitting the stone had to pass through 2 feet of dense material before reaching the cattail cavity, and the cavity then had to be bridged before reaching the inner log wall. Wind-driven infiltration, the real killer in a plains blizzard where pressure differentials drove outside air through every crack and gap in a conventional structure, was reduced to near nothing. The double wall design wasn't Erik's invention. Versions of it had been used in Scandinavian and German construction for centuries, but he had adapted it to available materials with the particular ingenuity of a man who couldn't afford to buy what he needed and so had to understand deeply what would serve the same purpose. The roof was the final piece of the puzzle and the element that drew the most sustained criticism. Erik didn't build a peaked roof. He built a low-angle shed roof with a slope of just 8 degrees, barely enough to shed water, that ran from the rear of the building, where it met the hillside at approximately 3 feet above grade, to the front, where it stood about 12 feet high. Over the roof frame of heavy timber he laid a double course of hand-split shingles, and then over those shingles he piled 18 inches of sod, actual cut prairie sod, laid grass side down with the dense root mat on top, held in place by a perimeter of stone. The total weight of the roof was enormous. The total insulating value was likewise enormous. "That roof is going to collapse the first heavy snowfall," said Arno Kirchenbauer with quiet authority. Kirchenbauer was a German-born carpenter, 44 years old in 1884, who had built 7 houses on the southern Nebraska frontier and who was the closest thing Cottonwood Creek settlement had to a professional. His skepticism carried weight. He'd seen roofs collapse. He'd pulled people out from under them. He walked around Erik's building site in October and calculated the load on the roof timbers with the practiced eye of a man who knew what failure looked like in advance. "The main beams," Kirchenbauer said. 8 inches? That's not enough for sod and snow both. 12 inches, Erik said. He showed Kirchenbauer the beam cross-sections he'd already cut. Kirchenbauer looked at them for a long moment. "Where did you get 12-inch timber out here?" "I saved it from the cottonwood along the South Creek Bend. 6 pieces, 3 years old when I cut them." Kirchenbauer ran his hand along the grain of the nearest beam. He was a carpenter. He respected good wood properly treated. He didn't say anything more about the roof collapsing, but he also didn't retract his general skepticism about the building's viability as winter shelter. The sod was too heavy, the slope too shallow, the whole structure too buried in the hillside. It would be dark inside. It would be damp. It would smell like cattle. He was right that it would smell like cattle. He was wrong about everything else. The cattle, in fact, were the final and most deliberately designed element of the building's thermal system. Erik partitioned the interior at the 40-foot mark, the eastern 2/3 of the structure for the animals, the western 1/3 for the family. The partition wall was log construction, tightly fitted, but with a series of 8-inch gaps near the floor level, each covered with a hinged wooden panel. When the outside temperature dropped, those panels could be opened to allow warm air from the animal quarters, generated by the body heat of 3 cows and 2 horses, which together produced roughly the equivalent of a continuous small wood stove fire, to flow into the living quarters under convective pressure. When the temperature moderated, the panels closed, and a separate ventilation gap near the roof ridge of the animal section carried excess heat and moisture outside. The living quarters had a small iron stove for cooking and supplemental heat, but its primary function was culinary. The warmth came from the walls, the earth, and the animals. A single adult dairy cow produces approximately 2,000 BTUs of heat per hour as a metabolic byproduct. 3 cows and 2 horses on a cold Nebraska January night were generating somewhere between 8,000 and 10,000 BTUs per hour in that animal section. The equivalent of a medium-sized wood stove burning at a moderate rate, except that it burned all night whether anyone tended it or not, and it required no additional fuel beyond what the animals needed to eat anyway. This is a good moment to stop and think about what that actually means. Erik finished the main structure by the 1st of November 1884, just ahead of that year's early cold. He'd also, by this point, acquired a wife, a Finnish woman named Maija Koronen, 32 years old, who arrived by train from Chicago in early October as part of an arrangement that had been conducted through correspondence with a Lutheran settlement organization and that had required, on Maija's part, a considerable leap of faith. She had grown up in Finland, not far from the Arctic Circle herself, and when she stepped off the wagon at her new home and saw the low, earthen, half-buried structure sitting in the hillside like a very deliberate part of the landscape, When she walked inside and felt the temperature and smelled the animals and looked at the packed earth floor and the small windows set deep in thick walls, she had one immediate question. Is there a proper kitchen range? There was. A good one, actually. An Acme Model B, second-hand but recently relined, purchased in McCook for $18. Maja Solberg walked through the building twice, looked at the wall construction with the methodical attention of a woman who had grown up near similar structures in Finland, and then began to unpack her trunk. She didn't comment on the cattail insulation or the sod roof or the partition panels. She understood what they were for. She'd seen it all before, translated into finished materials and finished slopes and finished creek draws, but the same essential logic. Her grandmother's house had worked the same way. The first winter, 1884 to 1885, was a moderately hard one. Not extraordinary by Nebraska standards, but cold enough to test the building properly. The temperature inside the living quarters, which Maja tracked with the same thermometer Eric had been using, never dropped below 57 degrees Fahrenheit, even on the 2 occasions when the outside temperature reached -22. The iron stove was burning for cooking twice a day, which added supplemental heat. On those coldest nights, Eric opened the partition panels for 4 hours and closed them again by midnight, and the interior temperature recovered fully by morning. Their fuel consumption for the entire winter was 4 cords of wood versus the 8 to 12 cords that neighboring families burned in their conventional frame houses. 4 cords was less than half. Clarence Pell heard this figure and didn't believe it. "You'd freeze," he said flatly, when Eric mentioned it at the general store in March. 4 cords won't heat a building through a Nebraska winter. "Come see the thermometer records," Eric said. Pell didn't come. He was a stubborn man, not a mean one, and he'd built his entire understanding of plain survival on a decade of hard experience that told him certain things were true. You needed a high site with good sight lines. You needed a tall stove, not a small one. You needed timber walls, not stone, because timber you could add to and repair. He wasn't wrong about any of these things in isolation. They were all legitimate lessons from legitimate experience. He just hadn't accounted for the possibility that someone might be operating from an entirely different set of principles that happened to produce better outcomes. This kind of thing is harder to absorb than it sounds, especially when your survival and the survival of your family have depended on trusting your own experience absolutely. This is the moment to remind you to like this video if you're finding the story valuable. We put significant time into researching these accounts, and every like tells the platform that this kind of content is worth recommending to people who might need it. The second winter, 1885 to 1886, was harder. A pair of blizzards in late January buried the southern prairie under 31 inches of consolidated snow, and 3 days of sustained -18 temperatures followed. By this point, the Solberg building had attracted a kind of grudging local attention. People didn't exactly praise it, but they'd stopped predicting its failure so confidently. Arno Kirchenbauer, who had not retracted his original skepticism, but who had never stopped thinking about that 12-inch cottonwood beam, rode out to check on Eric and Maya after the January storm broke, ostensibly out of neighborly concern, actually because his professional curiosity had finally gotten the better of him. What he found surprised him. The sod roof had shed the snow in a gradual, even way. The slight southern exposure warming the sod surface just enough during the midday hours to prevent the ice damming that had collapsed 2 shingled roofs in the county during that same storm. The stone outer wall showed no cracking, no frost heaving, no moisture penetration. The air inside the building, when Kirchenbauer stepped through the door and pulled off his hat, was warm. Not warm like a stove-heated room that goes cold when the fire dies down. Warm the way a cellar is cool. A steady background condition that required no maintenance to sustain. He stood in the living quarters for several minutes, looking at the walls and the roof and the floor, and then he walked the length of the building to the animal section, where the cattle and horses looked up at him with mild interest. The animals were in noticeably better condition than his own livestock, heavier, cleaner coated, calmer in their movements. He thought about that. "Your cows are warm," he said. "They are," Eric said. "Mine are cold. 2 of them lost weight this month." "They would." Kirchenbauer walked back to the partition wall and looked at the hinged panels near the floor. He was a carpenter. He understood immediately what they were for once he saw them. He stood there for a long moment with his hat in his hands. "I told everyone your roof would fall," he said. "I remember. It didn't fall." "No." Kirschenbauer put his hat back on. "I'd like to bring my wife to see this," he said. "Before I say anything more about it, I'd like her to see it." His wife, Greta Kirschenbauer, came 3 days later and walked through the building with the quiet, methodical attention of a woman assessing whether something was real or if it was a lucky accident waiting to reverse itself. She touched the inner log wall. She put her palm against the stone outer wall. Even through the interior plaster, it was warmer than the air outside, the stone having been storing heat for months. She looked at the sod roof from outside, at the even, heavy mat of frozen grass that was already showing the faintest suggestion of green at its edges where the south-facing exposure warmed it during midday hours. She went into the animal section and stood with the cows. When she came back out, she said to her husband, "We should have built ours differently." Kirschenbauer nodded once, slowly. That was the extent of the Kirschenbauer family's public revision of their earlier position, but it was enough. Kirschenbauer never again said anything critical about the Zollberg building, and in the spring of 1887 he consulted Eirich twice about the double wall technique while planning an addition to his own structure. He didn't build a combined barn dwelling. His German Lutheran sensibilities drew a firm line there, but the addition he built had 12-inch stone outer walls and a cattail-packed cavity, and it was warm the following winter. The third opposition voice was a man named Thaddeus Wren, who deserves particular attention because he wasn't a neighbor, wasn't a craftsman, and wasn't motivated by any personal stake in Eirich's success or failure. Wren was a land speculator from Lincoln who rode the circuit of southern Nebraska homestead communities twice a year, buying up claim rights from settlers who'd failed or given up and reselling them to later arrivals. He was 51 years old, well-dressed by frontier standards, and had the particular confidence of a man who'd been right about many things many times, and who had therefore lost the habit of considering the possibility that he might be wrong. He heard about the Zollberg building through the county grapevine in 1886 and rode out to see it, motivated partly by curiosity and partly by a calculation that a settlement centered on an unusual building technique might attract new settlers he could sell to. He arrived in August, when the building's advantages were least apparent. The sod roof was green and thick, blooming with prairie wildflowers. The interior was cool and dim. The animal section smelled like a barn, which it was. Wren walked through the building with a practiced real estate man's assessment, measuring mentally, calculating value, deciding what a man could reasonably claim the structure was worth on the open market. "It's a dugout," he finally said. "Sophisticated, I'll grant you that, but fundamentally it's a dugout. I've seen dozens of them. Half the settlers who build them abandon them within 5 years because they're dark and damp and they can't be improved or expanded." "This one can be expanded," Eirich said. "The hillside goes another 60 feet. And you'd dig another 60 feet out by hand? By hand and with horses, the same way I dug this one." Wren looked at him for a moment. "What do your neighbors think of it?" "Some have come around to it," Eirich said. Wren shrugged. He filed the building in the mental category he reserved for interesting curiosities that weren't commercially viable and moved on. He was still wrong in the most important way. He'd evaluated the building as a real estate asset rather than as a survival mechanism, but his observation about abandonment was not baseless. Many settlers who'd built earth-sheltered structures on the Great Plains had abandoned them, sometimes for the reasons Wren cited, sometimes simply because they'd proved the point, survived the early hard winters, and then moved up to frame construction once their finances allowed. The choice to stay with primitive construction when better options were available read, in many frontier communities, as poverty rather than wisdom. Eirich didn't particularly care how it read. The fourth voice of skepticism was the one that mattered most to Eirich, though he would never have admitted it, and it came not from a neighbor or a speculator, but from a letter. His older brother Gunnar Zollberg, still farming in the Tromsø district of northern Norway, had heard about Eirich's building through the irregular and often delayed network of family correspondence, and had written to say, with the diplomatic brutality only available to older brothers, that building a fjøsstue, a combined barn dwelling, the Norwegian term, on the American frontier was an embarrassment and a step backward, not forward. In Norway, the combined dwelling was associated with poverty, with remote subsistence farming, with the lowest social tier of rural life. Men and their families who lived with their cattle were men who couldn't do better. Gunnar was proud of his brother's immigration, proud of the American ambition it represented, and distressed to learn that Eric was reproducing on the Nebraska prairie the kind of primitive arrangement their own grandparents had lived in. Eric read this letter twice and then wrote back a reply that has been preserved in a collection of immigrant correspondence at the Nebraska State Historical Society. It is not long. It reads, in its entirety, "Dear Gunnar, I have 2 daughters now, both healthy. The building works. Come and see it when you can. Your brother, Eric." He didn't try to argue the case. He didn't defend the technique or cite its logic or explain the physics he understood empirically, if not mathematically. He had the patience of a man who knew the proof would come in its own time, in its own weather, and that when it came, no argument would be needed. The proof came on January 12, 1888. There had been signs the night before, if you knew how to read them. The temperature had been running 10 below since sundown on January 11th, which was cold, but not exceptional. What wasn't normal was the pressure. Eric had a simple aneroid barometer, another instrument his neighbors considered an eccentric affectation, and by 9 o'clock on the evening of the 11th it was falling with a speed and steadiness that he'd seen exactly once before, during a storm off the Norwegian coast in the winter of 1868 that had capsized 3 fishing boats and killed 11 men. He woke Maija and told her to heat extra water and move additional wood inside. He spent 2 hours carrying firewood from the covered stack and stacking it inside the living quarters until the floor was covered 3 feet deep along the north wall. He brought an extra 60 pounds of grain into the animal section and topped off the water troughs from the cistern. By 11 o'clock he had done everything he could do, and he went to sleep. The storm hit at approximately 4 in the morning on January 12th with a violence that woke everyone in the building, including apparently the cattle, which pressed together in the rear of the animal section and went very still. Eric lit the lantern and checked the thermometer. -14 outside, 63 inside. He banked the iron stove with a full load of split cottonwood, opened the 4 partition panels to the animal quarters to let body heat flow freely, and went back to sleep. His daughters, 2 and 4 years old, slept through the entire first day of the storm. The wind was extraordinary, sustained at approximately 48 miles per hour, with gusts that Eric estimated, from his experience of Norwegian coastal storms, where he'd learned to judge wind speed by sound and by what it did to familiar objects, at somewhere near 70. The snow was the particular fine, crystalline, dry snow of deep cold, not packing but driving, finding gaps and cracks with the persistence of sand in a desert wind. The frame houses on the ridge above Cottonwood Creek Settlement, 2 miles away, were experiencing this infiltration directly, cold air forcing through every gap in the timber framing, through the newspaper stuffing in the walls, around the ill-fitting window frames that wood expansion and contraction had warped over 3 years of plains temperature swings. Families in those houses were burning wood at a rate of nearly a cord every 2 days, keeping their indoor temperatures in the low 40s and mid-30s in exposed rooms. Children were sleeping in their coats, women were cooking in mittens. The fuel was running out for some of them, and the storm showed no sign of breaking. Inside the Solberg building, the temperature held at 63 degrees through the first day, dipped to 61 on the night of January 12th, recovered to 64 on the afternoon of the 13th, when a brief moderation in the storm allowed sunlight to hit the building's modest south-facing glazing, and settled at 62 for the entirety of the 14th, when the storm reached what survivors would later call its worst. Eric burned approximately 2/3 of a cord of wood during the entire 3-day storm, less than a single day's consumption for some of his neighbors. He opened the stove damper 4 times to cook and once to heat bath water for his older daughter, who had developed a mild fever on the 13th. The fever broke on the 14th. The stove was never more than a supplement to what the building itself was doing. On the morning of January 15th, when the wind finally dropped below 15 miles per hour and the temperature moderated to a relatively merciful -7, Eric opened the building's main door for the first time in 78 hours. The snow had drifted to the top of the doorframe on the north and east sides, but the building's orientation and the flanking ridge lines had created a sheltered zone in front of the south-facing entry where the drift was only 18 inches deep. He shoveled it clear in about 40 minutes, a job he described in his own account as not difficult. The building had a small south-facing window in the living quarters, set in a deep stone embrasure, and through that window, on the worst morning of the worst storm in Nebraska history, Maya Solberg had been able to see, intermittently, a narrow gray rectangle of blizzard sky. The news from the Ridge settlement was not good. It trickled in over the following days as neighbors dug out, checked on each other, and began the grim accounting of the storm's cost. The Oleander family, Peter and Annika and their 3 children, Dutch immigrants settled for 6 years, who had built a good solid frame house on the highest, most visible, most exposed ground in the area, were found on the 16th. The parents had died of hypothermia sometime during the second night. The children, 2 of them, had survived by remaining under both parents' bodies for warmth. The youngest, a girl of 3, was badly frostbitten on her hands and feet. Clarence Pell's hired hand, a young man of 19 named Charlie Brandt, who'd been caught in the storm returning from the Arapahoe store, was found 2 days later in a ravine half a mile from the Pell farm. He'd apparently tried to navigate home by feel and had walked in the wrong direction. He was 22 years old. Farther east, in the heavier settlement areas of Kearney County, the count was worse. Eric had lost nothing: no livestock, no family member, no frostbitten extremity, no illness beyond his daughter's brief fever, no structural damage beyond a section of the outer stone wall's mortar that had cracked in the freeze-thaw transition and would need repointing in spring. He had burned through less than a quart of his stockpiled wood. He had water still in the cistern. His horses and cattle had come through the storm in better condition than they'd entered it, the steady warmth of the animal section having actually reduced the caloric demands of maintaining their body heat, which meant they'd been able to put some of that energy toward condition and weight instead. Clarence Pell rode out to the Solberg building on January 19th, a full week after the storm had broken. He rode in silence for a while, looking at the structure, at the undamaged sod roof with its 18 inches of packed frost grass that had shed most of the snow in a clean margin around the building's perimeter, at the south-facing windows still clear and unobstructed, at the stone outer walls sitting in the landscape as if they'd always been there and always would be. He asked to come inside. Eric opened the door. Pell stepped in and stood for a moment without speaking. He pulled off his hat. He walked to the thermometer on the wall near the partition. Eric had been making twice-daily readings all through the storm, neat figures in the small leather notebook, and looked at the numbers. 63 on the 12th, 61 on the night of the 12th, 64 on the afternoon of the 13th. "This is real," Pell said. It wasn't a question. "It is." Pell stood there for another moment. Outside, the temperature was -9. Inside, it was 62. He could feel the difference between the two worlds. The grinding cold of the plains winter that had killed the Oleander parents and Charlie Brandt, and the quiet, steady, entirely natural warmth of this building that smelled like cattle and earth and wood smoke and looked like something a man's grandfather might have built. "I've been on this frontier for 17 years, Pell said. "I thought I understood it." Eric didn't answer immediately. He had 2 cord of wood still in the stack. He had a thermometer record that covered 3 days of the worst weather in Nebraska history. He had 2 healthy daughters and a wife who was already planning the spring garden on the South Bench. He had, in some sense, that he would not have articulated because it wasn't the kind of thing men articulated in 1888. Exactly what he'd come to this country to build. Something that worked. "You do understand it," Eric said finally. "You've survived 17 winters on it. That's real knowledge, too." Pell turned his hat in his hands. "Not the same kind." "No," Eric agreed. "Not exactly the same kind." The years after the blizzard of 1888 saw a quiet and unremarked shift in how several families in the Cottonwood Creek area thought about building. Arno Kirschenbauer expanded his stone wall addition and added a small sod berm along its north face. A Swedish family named Bergstrom, who'd lost 2 milk cows in the storm because their timber barn had reached 18 degrees Fahrenheit during the worst night, consulted Eric and built a new animal shelter the following summer that incorporated double walls and an earthen berm on 3 sides. They did not combine it with their dwelling. That remained a cultural step too far. But the principle transferred, and their cattle came through the following 3 winters without significant loss. Thaddeus Wren, the Lincoln speculator, heard about the Solberg building's performance in the blizzard through the network of county agent reports that the Nebraska Bureau of Agriculture was compiling on storm losses, and revisited his earlier dismissal. He didn't come back out to Cottonwood Creek, but he did mention the building favorably in a conversation with a group of potential investors he was trying to interest in Nebraska homestead land, describing it as evidence of what an experienced hand could do with native materials. He had quietly revised his characterization of the structure from a sophisticated dugout to an earth-sheltered dwelling of considerable utility. It cost him nothing to do this, and it was accurate. He was that kind of man. Eric Solberg lived in the barn cabin. He never called it that, but the name stuck in the local vernacular until 1901, when he and Mija and their daughters moved to a frame house in Arapahoe after the girls reached school age and the daily ride to town became impractical. He sold the building and the land to a Czech immigrant family named Novak, who lived in it for another 14 years and made several additions, all in the same double-wall stone construction, pushing the building another 40 feet into the hillside in the east extension that Eric had always said was possible. The Novaks reported, through a translator, that the building was the warmest they had ever lived in. The building's footprint is still visible on a private ranch in Furnace County, Nebraska. The stone walls stand to about 3 feet in most places, grassed over and incorporated into the landscape with the easy inevitability of things that were built correctly. The sod roof is long gone, but the roof beam positions are still marked by depressions in the berm line. Local historians have documented the site, and Eric's thermometer notebook, all 214 pages of twice-daily readings from 1884 to 1901, is in the Nebraska State Historical Society archive in Lincoln, cataloged under the unglamorous title Agricultural Records, Furnace County, 1884-1901. The January 1888 entries are the only ones in the book that Eric underlined. Not the numbers themselves, the dates. Modern building science has a name for what Eric built: an earth-sheltered thermal mass structure with passive solar orientation and integrated livestock heat exchange. Studies conducted by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln in the 1970s and 1980s, during the energy crisis years when passive building design was briefly fashionable again, found that earth-sheltered residential structures in the Nebraska climate zone required between 40 and 60% less heating energy than equivalent above-grade frame structures. The double-wall construction Eric used, 2-foot stone outer wall, 8-inch air and insulation cavity, 8-inch log inner wall, provides a composite thermal resistance that modern engineers calculate at roughly R27. Comparable to well-insulated modern construction and dramatically superior to the single-wall timber framing of the 1880s, which typically achieved R4 to R6. The cattail fluff insulation, measured in several surviving examples from period construction, tests at R3. 5 per inch, nearly identical to modern fiberglass bat insulation. He got there by watching what worked, by paying attention to what the old buildings in Norway could do that the new ones couldn't, by choosing, when he had the choice of building fast and cheap or building slow and right, to build slow and right. By caring more about what happened in the third winter than in the first spring. By ignoring, with patient and absolute consistency, the opinions of men who had not thought as carefully as he had about the specific problem in front of them. This is the last thing worth saying about Eric Solberg, and it isn't a complicated thing. He was not smarter than his neighbors. He wasn't more experienced, not on the Nebraska frontier. He hadn't survived more harsh winters in North America than Clarence Pell, or built more structures than Arno Kirschenbauer. What he'd done was carry a specific form of knowledge across the Atlantic with him, knowledge that had been accumulated and tested and refined over roughly 1,000 years of Scandinavian people trying to stay warm in cold places, and he'd had the confidence to apply it in a new landscape against the resistance of people who were operating from perfectly legitimate but incomplete information. That's not genius. That's inheritance. That's what it looks like when the accumulated wisdom of the generations before you is passed down, preserved, taken seriously, and used. The blizzard of January 1888 is remembered in the historical record as the schoolchildren's storm because of the particular tragedy of children who died trying to walk home from country schoolhouses when the storm hit with no warning in the early afternoon. The storm itself was indifferent. It killed who it could reach, and it couldn't reach the people inside certain kinds of buildings. It couldn't reach Eric Solberg's family. At 63 degrees on the worst night, the children asleep on the packed earth floor, the cows breathing slow warm clouds behind the partition wall, the stone outer wall standing in the dark, and the wind exactly as it had been designed to stand. The knowledge that built that wall didn't originate on the Nebraska plains. It didn't come out of any book or any government bulletin or any advertisement for modern homestead construction. It came from 1,000 years of Scandinavian winters and the practical ingenuity of people who couldn't afford to learn the lesson twice. Eric Solberg carried it in his hands and in his memory and in the small leather notebook in his shirt pocket, and he put it in the ground on a north-facing slope in Furnace County, Nebraska, where it held at 65 degrees while the worst blizzard in recorded history tried its absolute best to prove otherwise. That's the kind of knowledge worth preserving. If this story meant something to you, if you think about the men and women who built and survived and figured things out before we had the technology to make the figuring easier, then this channel is your home. We document these stories because they deserve to be documented, because the people in them deserve to be remembered, and because the knowledge they carried deserves to outlast the circumstances that made it necessary. Subscribe to keep this work going. Share this video with someone who still believes that the old ways have something to teach us. Leave a comment about the traditional building techniques you've seen in your own region. We read every single one, and they shape what stories we tell next. Eric Solberg sat at a rough-hewn table in a building that everyone had called crazy, eating corn porridge on the coldest morning of his life in America. His daughters played on the floor. The thermometer read 65 degrees. Outside, Nebraska was trying to kill everything it could reach, and it couldn't reach him. He had built his way out of its range, with stone and cattail fluff and the slow-breathing warmth of 5 large animals and the knowledge of 1,000 winters he'd never personally experienced. He had done, quietly and without drama, and against considerable ridicule, exactly what he'd come here to do.